to now give the floor to Mr. Balunovic from Serbia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you gave me quite a nice introduction to my talk by answering the additional question. I also think that the title of the discussion was posed. Actually, I will challenge the title of this discussion, and I changed it here in my notebook. Are radical ideologies a threat to democracy? What I firstly did, I made this to be singular. Is radical ideology a threat to democracy? Since I will argue in my talk that there is only one radical ideology. And then I will answer this question. And the very simple answer to this question is no. Radical ideology in singular is quite on the opposite, a chance for democratizing the undemocratic structure of our societies today. So, and I will start with answering the question, what is radical? Radical is usually perceived as something dangerous, something irrational, and finally something which is impossible to be put in practice, to be achieved. Argentinian political philosopher Ernesto Laclau argues that the radical act is taking place at the level of the ground of the social. So radical means challenging and questioning the very origins and the very roots of a certain system. It is true that radical can be sometimes subjective, or the notion of radical, and it can be put in different contexts. What is radical today? What was radical 200 years ago? What was radical 500 years ago? But I will argue that what today is radical can only come from the left spectrum of ideologies. Unlike what is coming from the right spectrum, which is always maybe extreme but not radical. This conclusion I made from the very notion of radical, what radical really means. Radical means challenging the roots of the system. No right-wing ideology or political organization or political practice has ever challenged the capitalist order. Quite on the opposite. It has been quite often used as the last source or the last guardian of the ideological framework or the dominant system. But I will come back to this later. What is also important is to say what radical politics can achieve or what radical politics is aiming at. Radical politics, in my view, is aiming at something we call radical emancipation. What does it mean? What that precisely means, radical emancipation. The origin of radical emancipation we can find already in Christianity. An important notion is that the division between the contradictory sides or the opposite sides is very sharp. So you have a division between good and evil, if we talk about Christianity. Radical emancipation, in terms of Christian theologists, would mean that you cross that sharp line between good and evil, usually in the direction of good. What that means in secular terms, in today's political philosophical terms. Who can help us is probably the most famous and one of the most important philosophers of 20th and 21st century, Alain Badiou, who is making this difference between possible and impossible. So what used to be the border between the good and the evil today became the border between possible and impossible. What we hear from the political mainstream is usually that our demands for abolishing the relations of domination, abolishing the socioeconomic system of capitalism is impossible. So we have a very sharp division line between what is possible from the mainstream ideologist political perspective and what is not. With that respect, what would be radical today, or what would represent radical emancipation, would be crossing that line between possible and impossible, not accepting the systematically imposed framework of our acts, not accepting that radical change, the change of the roots, are impossible today. But you also transfers this division of possible and impossible into the sphere of happiness and satisfaction. He argues that one can be happy only once when he or she crosses that line of possible or impossible. Otherwise, our lives would be filled with everyday satisfaction or lack of satisfaction. So acting within the imposed ideological framework can make us being satisfied with ourselves. We can find a decent job, we can have a family, we can get a loan, we can buy a car, we can, until the rest of our lives, pay off that loan, and then our daily lives are consistent of something he calls satisfaction. But the true happiness is really a radical act. A radical act means finding what is possible in the sphere of impossible. So trying to find the sphere for our acts, for our practice, in what had been previously defined systematically as impossible. And this is the only way, in his view, and I agree, that we can reach happiness. To come back to the initial claim. Today we live in what another French philosopher, Jacques Rancière, calls the consensus politics, the politics of consensus. So you are constantly trying to make consensus with the ruling class. What this consensus politics practically means is accepting your subordinated position with regards to the ruling class. On the other hand, the ideological center or the ideological mainstream is using different instruments for legitimizing this state of domination. And one of the most powerful means of legitimization of today's system is precisely this equalization of the right and the left-wing political ideas. And what we have in the title of this discussion is precisely that. This comes, of course, most famously from Hannah Arendt's equalization of two totalitarian regimes, Stalinism on one side and Hitler's Third Reich on the other side. But this is another debate on whether or not, and of course, both systems were totalitarian. But this doesn't mean that both right-wing and left-wing ideas are radical. At the beginning, I argued that there is no such thing as right-wing radicalism. The right, as I already mentioned, not only that it has never challenged the capitalist order, the capitalist systematic essence and the framework, but it has been more often used as a last guardian of the system, as I already stressed. We can find numerous examples on this kind of practice. Adolf Hitler did not have in his room any other picture but the picture of Henry Ford. Adolf Hitler, if you read Mein Kampf, and I would highly recommend you to read that book for this purpose, just to see who were the people or the systems he was admiring at. That was British imperialism. And we know from Lenin that imperialism is last or the most, the last stage of capitalism. What Hitler was doing was the last or the most efficient stage of capitalism. Today we have a similar situation. Take as an example Hungary and Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban is today considered as a bad guy among European leaders. What he is doing, building a wall on the Serbian-Hungarian border, introducing policies which are neo-fascist in their essence, is something that we usually see as confronting what we call European values. And all the European leaders are talking about him as a bad boy, as a dissident of the European Union. But what Orban is doing actually represents European unconscious. What you can see within Hungary, I don't know how familiar you are with the political situation in Hungary. You have Fidesz, which is Orban's party, and you have Jobbik, which is openly neo-fascist. So members of Jobbik party were patrolling in the suburbs of Budapest, in the majority Roma populated communities, taking care of security. Sorry? Yeah. And Orban didn't want to deal with it. He just created a systematic framework where a neo-fascist practice can be conducted. Overnight, when the danger, so-called danger of immigration, of asylum seekers, of refugees, became so alarming for the whole European Union, Orban started behaving as Jobbik was behaving externally, as Jobbik was behaving internally. So Jobbik was Orban's unconscious. And on the other hand, Orban is European Union's unconscious. And it's only the matter of time of when European Union will transform its unconscious into its direct action. And actually that day came. And it was only yesterday when Germany closed its borders with Austria. When we saw that all those big words and all those big concepts, those empty signifiers such as democracy, solidarity, empathy, and so on, all framed with so-called European values, were put aside. And this is why I argue that the right wing is actually safeguarding the systematic framework for socio-economic relations that are dominating our societies. Finally, another point is another interesting reference here can be, again, related to Orban, but in comparison to Syriza. Look the reaction of European leaders and the European bureaucrats to Syriza and to Orban. How different they were. And not because Syriza is a revolutionary organization, it's not. But it's maybe halfway, it's the best we have. And I think we should support. But look the discrepancy between the reaction of European leaders and the European institutions in relation to Syriza and to Orban. When he built the wall, they say, oh, this is another wall after 25 years after we removed the Berlin Wall. This is a bad thing, but what can we do? When Syriza tried to challenge the policies of the European Union, this kind of neo-imperial policies, they broke their back completely. And now finally, I would pose a question, and it's also a question I would just offer an answer, and it can be the question for a discussion. What is radical today in our region, in this former Yugoslavian region? Coming back to the definition of radical, so it means that what kind of acts and thoughts we should produce today to challenge the roots of our societies here in the Balkans. And then we should answer the question, what are these roots? I argued that these roots are bloody, and we can kind of all agree upon the roots of our societies. So our societies were made upon wars. They were made, so the legacy of our societies can be found in ethnic cleansing, in mass murders, in genocide. So the roots of our societies are highly criminal and highly bloody. And the roots were there in order for our societies to become nation states. On the other hand, the so-called nation building is the main determinant or the main precondition for Euro integration. If you connect the two, you can argue that genocide, ethnic cleansing, and massive crimes were the first step in the process of European integration. Therefore, what can be radical today? How we should challenge the roots of our system? That challenge cannot come nationally, because we are challenging the roots of nation state, which are by definition bloody and based on crime. That challenge and that radical thought and radical act has to come internationally. If we talk about the region, it has to come internationally in the post-Yugoslavian space. But we have to go further. And this reaction has to come internationally on the European, even on the European level, even wider than that. And finally, what has happened because of lack of this kind of reaction, a radical reaction? We are stuck into liberal societies which are claiming to be the most open societies where you can make whatever choice comes to your mind. But liberal societies are closed for a radical choice. It is not allowed to make a radical choice in liberal democracies or in liberal so-called democracies. We are not even allowed to come up with an act of, tragical end. We decide to tragically end our journey. We are not even allowed to do that. Instead of that, we are convicted to the endless tragedy. And this is the outcome of the lack of radical politics in the last 25 years in this region. And I think that if we want to find a way out from the possible into the sphere of impossible, if we want to reach radical emancipation, which is necessary for our happiness, then we have to think and act in terms of radical ideas. Thank you.